And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Tom Whitman to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Claire. I'm Tom Whitman, and I'm the statewide GIBMP coordinator with the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. And it's my pleasure to get to introduce our speakers today. We'll start first with Debbie Mola Mickler. She's been part of the Disney Horticulture team at Walt Disney World Resort for 34 years, and I've known her for most of that. Throughout her career, Debbie has worked in many aspects of Disney horticulture, including greens, set design, interior plant maintenance, and nursery production. Debbie's current role is area manager for the Walt Disney World Nursery. Debbie and her team provide hanging baskets, topiaries, and specialty displays throughout Walt Disney World Resort and beyond. Debbie is called upon often to do presentations for garden clubs and horticultural enthusiasts, showcasing Disney's horticulture specialties. Through her love for plants and Disney's horticulture, she's developed a passion for Disney's horticultural heritage, and she's certainly a wealth of knowledge. I can't wait to hear her presentation today. Presenting along with her is Season Steib, who's been working in the horticulture department at Walt Disney World for at least 20 years. Currently, she works at the Walt Disney World Nursery and has been involved with designing the containers for various festivals and events. She recently designed over 500 containers for the Epcot Flower and Garden Festival, which is in full swing right now. I'm so excited to have these ladies present for us today. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie and Season, and they're presenting A Moveable Feast for the Eyes, Container Gardening.
Well, thank you, Tom, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for the University of Florida for letting us have this opportunity to present to you. It's not very often that we present to folks outside of Walt Disney World, so this is really a gem of a day for us. So one thing I would like to talk about to start our presentation is to give you an overall view of Disney horticulture. Disney horticulture not only encompasses our roles here at the Walt Disney World Nursery, but all the landscapes of the parks and resorts. And as our director says, we are guardians of the first impression. So as the guests come into our parks or even drive into our toll plazas, the first thing you see is landscaping, turf, flower beds, and some of our hanging baskets or potted containers. So thousands of containers are integrated into the landscapes of Walt Disney World. I was just thinking about this. I don't think we really have a true inventory of how many containers we have. The containers are moved around and used for many different jobs so often that keeping an inventory would be pretty hard. But also I want to include with the container gardens, I want to say hanging baskets too, because we do have hanging baskets in our parks, and we have hundreds of hanging baskets that we put into our parks and theme for different areas, and then we grow them back here at the Walt Disney World Nursery. And the Disney Nursery was established in 1967. And right now we have 12 greenhouses, and any of the greenhouses range from about 3,000 to 6,000 square feet each. The main function of the nursery, though, is to support the parks and resorts, and we do specialty items. We run our interior plantscaping department out of our nursery and also our green support. So that could be anything from a wedding to a special event. Our biggest production is our Epcot Flower and Garden Festival, and this is we're into our 30th festival this year that we put together. The first festival was 30 days, about 30 days. Now we're up to over 120 days, all going until July. So the things you see in the beginning of the festival may not be the same things you see in July, because we changed the bedding plants and containers several times to match the seasons here in Central Florida. The scale is so big for the production of the Flower and Garden Festival that we have to set up temporary areas backstage at the nursery, in parking areas and pull-off areas, just to be able to accommodate all the containers that we put together. So why do we do container gardening at Disney? I thought of 6 or 7 reasons why, and the number one that always comes to my mind is safety. So this may be like to say, stand back, do not enter. You can put containers in, they look appealing to the eye, but it's saying stand back, safety. Another reason would be so you don't step off into an area that may be a few stairs, smaller stairs, so we may put containers in for that. Also, containers are low maintenance. They reduce water use, and more so than a traditional flower bed, even though we do go out and maintain our containers mostly every day. They draw your attention, they're very directional. They create a welcome statement, or they can break up space on a wall, driveway, and creates privacy. And for us, it's almost instant. If we're going to have a private party, say at Epcot, we could be called upon to bring our movable containers that have wheels on them out to set these up just so that they could have a private event. Also, when we can create containers, we think about theming purposes and supporting the storyline. So on the right-hand side, we have a picture of Twining's Tea, and this is at our UK pavilion for the Epcot Flower and Garden Festival. So there are around 10 different extra large teacups, and then we put hanging baskets inside of those, and we put the plants that are in the tea in the basket to present. So the tea bag hangs over, you can see the ingredients to the right. And I believe that's a really good example of supporting the story or the theme. And then their instant color accent in the garden. We do have a show 365 days a year. So even though the Flower and Garden Festival ends in July, we still have a lot of other containers out on display. And then we bring them out for specialty reasons. We do a holiday show at Epcot, Festival of the Holidays, where each country is decorated with containers and themed towards whatever country that is. And there's hundreds of containers that we put out for that. I showed this slide because this is a good example of the number of containers that could be on display. So even though Season has put together 500 containers for the Epcot Flower and Garden Festival, and that would be displays throughout the whole park, this is an additional display of close to probably close to 300 containers that is just at Italy. They're themed for springtime. The colors have to be softer colors. We wouldn't use bright orange in this area. And each country would have its what we call a theme statement or color palette, so we know which colors to use. So I thought a fun way to talk about container gardening was like, what about 3 new buzzwords? We always have the 3 words. They've been around for many, many years. The thriller, the filler, and the spiller. Well, here we don't necessarily do all 3 in containers. And it depends on where you're putting a container. You may do the thriller, the filler, and the spiller. But our idea of containers is pretty powerful and pleasing, and a lot of solid colors. We use a lot of solid colors because they are so impactful in the landscape. So you may use different varieties of plants, but you're going to go with that one color, and that really makes things punch. Also, here we have to think about function. It has to have a clear sense of purpose that fits with the style of its surroundings and the cohesion and ambiance of the environment. So this was taken at the Contemporary Resort. This was only half of the Eugenia poodles that are on display. I think I counted there's about 14 total, but this creates cohesion throughout the area. There's no annuals in this, no color of annuals in this area, but the containers themselves and the plant materials draw your eye, and it's very directional. So I put this slide in too because I said, know your client. It may not work. And think about when you meet your clients and you could put a landscape design together. You could meet with your team. You could think about ordering all these containers and plants. And then you go to meet the client to give them the final dress rehearsal before you were going to do the job. And they say, no, I don't want that. I think I would like something more contemporary. So even though you have all these great ideas in place, know your client, it may not work. And we have to do that quite a bit, where we may think something may work in an area, and then we go and we have to really be able to adjust even in any situation. So when you do your containers, think about this. Are you going to be like nurturing it for success? Is there going to be some time where these plants will be young and they'll have some time to grow? Here at Walt Disney World, we don't have that. We don't have that space of letting it grow out. We have to actually grow it to almost a mature plant, and then we're putting it out, and we call that instant show. Where a homeowner or a client, you may have that time, or is it instant gratification? So that's us taking things out, putting them right out in the landscape. And this would be a good photograph to look at for an instant landscape, something that was planted over the course of one night or 2 nights behind a construction wall. We put construction walls up in certain areas where we're going to do large display gardens, and then we'll add these flowers or containers to that area, and we'll plant this out all in one night, so the guests would never see that process of the plants growing. And then think about your location. Think about the location and all the elements. Is it going to go on a patio? Is it going to go on a wood deck, a driveway, stairways, things like that? This is a display we do at Disney Springs, and these flowers are changed out per season, probably every 3 months, 4 to 6 times a year sometimes, especially with the holiday display. But think about all those elements and where the containers are going to sit in the process. And then where do I get my ideas from? So not only do I have great peers and partners such as Season, where we can bounce ideas off of each other, but also I go to a lot of seminars. I got a lot of garden shows. I get a lot of books, any new books that come out. I love watching the PBS garden shows on television to get some new ideas. And then how do my ideas come into my head? Okay, so I go to the landscape show. I'm taking a lot of photographs. I'm taking them back. I get the catalogs. I don't necessarily have time to go through all the catalogs when I get back, but at least I try to take a photograph and write down the name of the vendor and what item do they have that I would be interested in. It would not maybe be all of the items, but what's that one thing that makes them stand out for something that I would be utilizing here at Walt Disney World. I also, part of the FNGLA, Florida Nurserymen and Growers Association, and part of the Knowledge College. I use my cell phone a lot to take photographs, or if I see an article, I usually do a little clip picture of it and save it. I use Google a lot to research plants. Facebook is a great place, especially for garden enthusiasts. You can really get into some nice gardening groups and see what's going on as far as trends. Pinterest is another great place for inspiration, for ideas. Email each other. I go to a lot of blogs. I follow 5 or 6 blogs religiously each week. Seed catalogs or garden catalogs. I like to, when you're eating lunch, to sit down, maybe spend a few minutes going through these catalogs to see what's out there. I love going to botanical gardens, either here in my own area, or if I'm on vacation, I make sure I hit at least one botanical garden or a garden center in a different area so I can see what other trends are out there. The garden center is my best friend for finding new ideas, because they're always going to have the newest plants and products out there for me to look at. And the last thing is just let's talk. I love it when a friend calls and says, hey, do you want to go at this last weekend? I went to an orchid show over in over there by Merritt Island, and she just called me up and said, hey, you want to take a drive over? In that conversation over in the ride, just talking about plants and collecting ideas for some things that'll be coming up. And I always think about this, if they're growing it, I'm using it. It's something that I've stuck by for a while now, because we could trial all the plants we want here. Do they grow them in mass quantities? Sometimes we have to pre-book those things. But I try to find things, what we call off the shelf. Off the shelf is something that a garden, regular box store would have, or your growers are putting out there on their availabilities. See what they're doing. You could even compare 3 different growers. Are they growing the same thing? And what is those varieties that they're trying out? Because I think that's where Seasons had, and she'll talk a little bit about that, most success with her containers, is if they're growing it, I'm using it, or I'm at least trying it. So to kind of wrap that up, who do I follow? Well, I follow our Disney Imagineers and our landscape architects cues on a lot of things. We'll get a landscape plan for the Flower and Garden Festival. So in our roles, we have to know how to read landscape plans and decide the plant material in containers. But that is not always the tried and true, because you have your own ideas that you can implement into that design, or information you could provide those Imagineers. Floral designers, I think, are a great, if you could follow some of those, especially for current trends in flower color. You know, what's out there in floral design color and shapes and styles. Industry leaders. I love talking to our industry leaders. Landscapers, design, build, and growers. Chefs are great. Another resource if you're into vegetable gardening or having your clients growing their own. Farmers, home decorators, garden celebrities. And really, the garden celebrity thing, I put that on there, but I really like to say you could be a celebrity and maybe not know a lot about plants. But if you really know about plants, that's the person that I want to talk to. So container selection. And we're going to talk a few minutes about this. When we go to select containers, over the years, we have to say we've come up with our staple containers here for Walt Disney World. And they could be made out of many different things, but one of the main things you need to think about, how are you going to move that container to the site? Or how are you going to get it off a truck? So we get, this is a picture of me. We did a brand new garden at Epcot last year, and we had to buy in containers, but we had to buy them in massive quantities. So this was just part of the delivery that got off the truck. But a lot of times I get a call from a vendor and they'll say, you know, we'll deliver it, but you have to be able to get it off the truck. So think about that if you're going to be doing any big display, is how are you going to transport it safely, and how are you going to get it off a truck or a vehicle without it breaking? Oh, and you know, we've even been requested to do the bathtub. So we've had a bathtub in our inventory for quite a number of years. Things to consider, considerations is, oh wait, I want to go back to the container selection first again. So I want to talk about one last thing, is the number one types of containers that we use here. The number one is the ceramic glazed container. You can get these in a lot of different colors and styles. They've been available for probably a good 10 or 12 years. And cobalt blue is our number one color utilized here. You could do anything from tropical to contemporary containers in that cobalt blue. It's a staple color that we carry when we never have enough of them. And then clay and terracotta, like as pictured here with me with the containers. Make sure that you're buying high quality terracotta, because if you're not buying that made in Italy high quality in terracotta, you'll see a lot of algae build up on the sides of containers. They're very porous. They'll start to break down. The next one I want to talk about is plastic or rotomolded plastic. There's a lot of plastic on the market right now, but make sure they're sun resistant. So you may have to spend a little bit more money, but when you come back in 5 years, that container will be exactly that same color. And a lot of places now, wholesale container vendors actually provide a warranty, a 10-year warranty with some of those containers. So if they do get discolored, you can return and get new ones. Whiskey barrels, as pictured in here. Whiskey barrels are probably another one that's really high on our list because they're so versatile. They have a really extremely large, wide mouth of the container to plant, so you can really pack the plants in. Metals, we stay away from those because they corrode. They cause a lot of interaction with the pavement and discoloration. Styrofoam we used for many years, but it's breakable, especially if you're in any cold weather, and it breaks down and the color seems to wear off. You can repaint them, but it's never the same. And concrete, concrete. That's probably the one we steer away from the most because a concrete container is so heavy, unless you have the ability to move it. And once it's there, it's not moved again. We're moving the containers all the time. Like as you see in the picture they're on pallets, all our containers are always on pallets and we move them with electric pallet jacks. And the last one is this concrete, the new fibercrete option. We haven't used very many of them, but the ones that I have used, I've really started to like them. So when we're going to put containers out, one thing you want to think about is scale. You know, how big should you go? Because I put a picture here on the bottom of 2 spirals. So sometimes I'll set it up or I'll have a person stand next to the container so I could see the height of the plants. Because once we purchase that and then we get it to location, what if it was too big or too small? And you're not getting what you want. And then when we order live plant material from nurseries, I always ask for a photograph with either a measuring stake, if it's say a tree, or a person in the picture. So at least I'll see the scale of the plant material. We buy plants here, so many plants here at the nursery, and you really can get something you don't expect if you don't follow these rules. And I really try to stick to them, even when I buy bedding plants sometimes. If it's something that's that particular, I want to see a picture before we purchase it. So think about how the container is going to sit: hardscape, including walls, decks, driveways, stairways, porches, etc., etc. The interaction with the surface environment. We've learned this a lot. We put some containers on rubber mulch last year, and within a few weeks they were tilting to the side, and we never really could get them straight. So we use a lot of pavers, just the little small square pavers. We'll lay them on the soil and then put the container on it, so it gives it more of a level surface. Also, think about stains, scratches, damage from maintenance equipment. We have a lot of containers that can get damaged by off-road vehicles such as golf carts, but then also ECVs. With our guests trying to get through areas where there are some larger containers, there could be some scratches. But I have found if I call the company where the container came from, they usually have maintenance kits you can purchase, and they will be the exact color of the container, so you can do touch-ups. So use feet and tile, something to lift it off the surface. We deal a lot with algae because we do use we do wash down our sidewalks at night. So there's a lot of algae built up that could be around the containers. By lifting it up a little bit, at least you can pressure wash or put a high pressure hose underneath the containers. And measure, you know, how big should you go? Because wide mouth containers are the best. I really steer away from any kind of vase shaped or anything that's got a small top, because if you put a tree or a shrub in that container, in a year or two, you'll never be able to get it out, and you're either going to lose the container, you know, you'll have to break the container if you want to save the tree, or you'll have to kill the tree to try to save the container. We've had instances where we haven't been able to do either one of those and just had to dispose of the container and the tree altogether. I think that, you know, considering going past your zone 9B, because you can really push the limits, you know, because think if you're only doing annuals in your containers, only think short term, 3 to 4 months. And drainage, I can't say drainage enough. People love to overwater. They think, you know, plants need, oh, we need to love them some more. Let's add some more water. But for us, drainage is so important. So even if you're putting holes in the bottom of a large container, we always will add, we rinse it off first. We'll rinse off some gravel and put that in. And we even had an instance recently where we had a lot of discoloration on a patio and we could not figure it out. And I think we, finally it came down to it was the actual soil that we had purchased, that the soil had some sort of amendment in it, that it was discoloring the sidewalks. So we had to change the whole thing out. And then thinking about your maintenance. So here's just a small trick of the trade. And this is really shot by color. We here at Walt Disney World meet with our landscape architects and our Imagineers a lot, and we talk about color, and they're always giving us these color chips, Pantone color chips, or PPG, try to match this color. So a few years ago, they gave me a swatch and I went to the garden center and I said, how could we find out if we are on trend or picking out the container? So if the house is going to be this Pantone pink yarrow, I bring that swatch with me to the garden center and I start looking through some of the containers. So this was when I actually went to shop, I took some pictures and I was so pleasantly surprised to see how these colors on this paint chip were really following along with the colors of the containers that were on trend. But then you could always go to your semi-neutral color here. When everything else fails, just go to your tans and browns. So this slide here, I just wanted to show you how our containers are organized in our holding area. We have thousands of containers, but what we did a few years ago is we divided them all up by color. So if you need to go and do a project, you can go to the back of our facility and you would shop by color: blue, white, brown, terracotta. You go to that section and then they're sort of organized by style. And then you can go in and you can select the containers that you need. This makes it so much easier, especially since we're moving in and out with so many hundreds of containers at the same time. This is something we started using 2 years ago, and it really has been a gem for us. We have electric pallet jacks. We have 6 electric pallet jacks. They move all day long, 8 hours a day. So instead of us having to physically pick things up, we try to find ways to prevent a lot of back strain. So we got this lift. It's called a stacker, and it's mostly used in warehouses, but it allows you to do is work at waist level. So you can pick up a whole pallet of containers, and then you can work at them at waist level. So you're not always bending over as you're creating these hundreds and hundreds of containers. These are just a few examples as I turn it over to Susan here in a few slides, where it's just I just wanted to showcase what would be a great continuity of color, showcasing some containers that we don't use. A lot of vase-shaped containers or anything that's smaller in the bottom than the top that are near guests, because they're easy to tip over. Even if you put rocks in the bottom, whatever you can try to do, they could still be tipped over unless they're screwed into the ground. So this would be out of guest reach. And always think out of the box when you're thinking about containers, because a client may have an old fountain and it's just not functioning and you struggle to get the thing to work. You could always do these amazing displays. So we have changed this several times and put this fountain in several different gardens throughout the years. But the particular year we had it here, it was a tropical theme. And I thought to myself, wow, this is very, very long lasting. It has lots of thrillers, fillers, and spillers. You could change out some of these things as they decline. You don't have to change them all out, but it's always got that vibrant punch to it. Here's just a really nice picture I like to always showcase of the consistency of color, like how we've gone up with the color with our hanging baskets on the railings. This is a great way to add color if you have a client that has a nice railing. We actually zip tie the hanging baskets to the railing. We grow them back here at the nursery, and then we put them out, and they'll last 3 to 4 months on show, and then we'll put another set of baskets out. This picture I picked because I felt like the containers draw my eye. So a lot of times we'll have containers for directional, but we put hanging baskets in, and also some of these largest containers to draw your eye to something that's very important, because this walkway goes either right or left. But when you come out of the resort down the stairs, you're going to see over to where the boat launch is, so you can get over to Epcot. And here this is a good example of where we use that one solid color, and we even do containers of just green. And I just really wanted to share these pictures because it was something we did a few years ago, and it was meet the plants that inspire your emotions, but I think it's the containers that inspired my emotion. These containers were silver and we had them in storage. We had them painted with automotive paint. There was a local vendor that does automotive painting and could take them there and really do a nice professional high-end job, real glossy paint on these. These really make me happy. When I see these containers, it makes me happy, and it thinking of spring. So the containers are secondary, but it draws my eye to the whole display. Then those same containers in their basic silver color could be utilized for warm colors for the fall. And then also painted gold, they were added to a pollinator garden. So you're not really looking at the containers too much, you're looking at the plants. But the color scheme is the oranges and the golds. So think about this. Think about have good resources for your plants. Some vendors have a specialty. For working here at the nursery, we meet so many different vendors, but a lot of them have very unique things that they grow the best. So they may grow geraniums or sun patience the best. So you may rely on them. Be ready to pre-book when possible. So if you know a project's coming up, you want to get with your vendors early to make sure you can get what you want. And don't put all your eggs in one basket. So sometimes our jobs are really big and we're concerned, are those plants going to be ready in time? And sometimes we double book the plants from 2 different vendors. So we end up getting 2 different results when we get the plants in, and deciding on which ones we're going to use, and then we'll use the other plants and containers. And be ready to punt, because off the shelf can produce amazing results. So the picture on the right are some geraniums that we grew right after COVID. We were going to put together the festival, but we didn't pre-book anything. So we used all off-the-shelf items. And I have to say, these geraniums were just, I've never saw so many geranium flowers on these flower towers. They were just really, really well. It was a good year for geraniums. And this just showcases the amount of things we do. So these are our flower towers, allowing us that vertical color. And these are sun patience for the spring. We got some geraniums we do early spring. And then we have a secondary set. And these are our sweet potato lime heart. And we use these just in case the sun patience don't work. So these sit back at the nursery. And if the sun patience don't last till July, we put them out. And one of the things we do here is we do shear the sun patience. So I was at Epcot this morning and I saw the folks out with the head shears. And when I first started dealing with sun patience, I didn't think they sheared well. Regular impatiens, they do shear well, but surprisingly enough, sun patience really, they do well with shearing. So that is my last slide. I am going, and keep good records. This is my final. And then we're going to have, I'll have Season come on. Keep good records, especially for colors. So we may get 6 or 7 different geraniums in. They may say, oh, we can't provide that geranium, but we're going to bring this one. I make sure I take flowers off. I don't just go by the plant tag, and I lay them out and I keep good records, because you really can have a great success. Because this geranium pictured here, this red geranium, this is a caliente, and we always grew calliope medium and dark red. Well, this one, Caliente Fire, is just a phenomenal geranium, and it's still actually blooming in our basket house right now. So I'm going to turn this over to Season. I thank you for your time, and she'll be doing the next part of this presentation.
Hello, everyone. We're going to be talking about plant selection now. So one good thing when you're choosing a plant is to refer to the color wheel. And complementary colors are opposite each other on the color wheel, such as orange and blue. And then you can also use like a monochromatic design. So that's where you have different shades of one color. So the container will have all pink plants in there, but different shades from light to dark. And then also we can use warm colors, which are like yellows, golds, oranges, and reds. Those will create excitement and they'll definitely attract attention. Then also we have cooler colors that are blues and violets, and they create a more tranquil and soothing mood. And then white color annuals. White is a color that pretty much goes well with any other color, but it can also be effective alone. And then when we're planting containers, we want to make sure when we're choosing the plants that they all have the same water and light requirements. That's very important. And then we also want to make sure we're choosing nice, healthy plants that are free of pests and diseases. So here we have, this is one of the displays I did at the Four Seasons Resort. This was promoting the Flower and Garden Festival. And the containers here, we chose cobalt containers mixed in with some like greener colors. And this display here, I was out here 5 days a week checking on the plants to make sure they were well watered, and then deadheading. Deadheading is removal of the blooms that are starting to fade. So that was very important to keep this display looking nice all the time. Then here are some examples of different containers that we use at Walt Disney World. We have some ceramic glazed containers. The ones on the far left, they actually have, it looks like paint is dripping down the containers. And those I like to use for the Festival of the Arts festival over at Epcot Center, because that goes well with the theming there. And then in the center, we have terracotta containers, and those are very versatile. We can use those at pretty much any location. And then we also have some more ceramic containers that are a cobalt blue color, and we use those a lot in the Mexico Pavilion and add a lot of tropical plants to those containers. Then here we have, we're just showcasing some bright, vibrant colors that we use throughout the parks. And that's what Disney is about. We're all about color. And then here we have a display that's part of the Flower and Garden Festival. This was a display for the Toy Story, and theming is very important here. So it's always a good idea to look at the architecture and the color of buildings and landscaping and the surrounding area when you're trying to decide which type of plants and containers to
I
choose.
find that in your Apple Music library. You can ask me to play.
And then also,
or ask for your music.
a design plan is a good tool. It'll, like when we have a Flower and Garden Festival going on, so the architects, they will draw blueprints of the displays, and sometimes they're very specific in which type of container they want to use and the plants as well. And here for the theming, we actually had some custom containers created that look like toy building blocks. And we have a variety of annuals that we placed in those, and these seem to fit the theming quite nicely. Then also we have plant placement. So usually when you're designing a container, I like to put like taller plants in the back or in the center of the container. And then the plants that are kind of closer to the edge, I will tilt slightly forward, because we want to make sure we're not able to see any of the soil in the container. And then I will usually mix like 1 gallon plants with 4-inch plants, because here at Disney, we're all about the instant gratification. So we want a container that looks nice and mature. So if I combine the different sizes, I can fit more plants in the container. And then also, if you have a lower growing plant, you can put those towards the front, and then the taller plants in the taller containers put towards the back. And then here are some just some pictures of different containers that we've designed over the years. We have some caladiums and some ornamental grasses and salvia. And one plant that we have featured here on the far right is some supertunias called Mini Vista Indigo. And these performed extremely well for us. I had these growing at the Four Seasons, and I was out there 5 days a week deadheading them, removing all the blooms. And because I was keeping up with the maintenance, they had nonstop color. Then next we have some examples of containers where we have some nice bright bold colors. And on the left, we have some celosia. And the celosia is just a one monochromatic display, but it's very bold and striking. And then here we have containers that are full of succulents. And the great thing about succulents is they are very low maintenance. They don't need a lot of water, and you don't have to do very much deadheading, and they can handle the full sun. And here we tried to find some more unusual varieties of succulents to have showcased here. And then next we have some examples of some hanging baskets. So in the far right top, we have some caliente geraniums being showcased. And then one thing that's very unusual is we have taken all of our hanging baskets are created with sphagnum. And we took a sphagnum basket and we soaked it in water, and we have it upside down, and we sprinkled some ryegrass seed, and we let the ryegrass seed germinate and get really full. And then we were able to turn it right back up, and we planted some annuals in there, and those are very nice for like Easter and springtime. Then here we have some vegetables that we have growing. And one thing we use, some of our containers, like we'll have some galvanized containers, they actually don't have a bottom. So we have some black fabric bags that we use, and we grow the vegetables in there, and then we can just like slide them into the container. And the vegetables here, they're always fun to grow. We had very good success with growing like Swiss chard and some beets, eggplants. We've grown a large variety of vegetables. And then some of the containers that we use are kitchen cooking pots, and those are kind of whimsical to use, and it's just a fun, different container. And we actually went ahead and drilled holes in the bottom for drainage of these cooking pots. And then also, sometimes we want to feature like citrus trees, so we try to find like smaller, citrus trees, like a kumquat is like a smaller version of maybe some of the orange trees. They get like quite large. Here we have, this is one of the attractions that we used to have at Epcot called the Universe of Energy. And one nice thing about this display was you had the bed had the nice bright blue cobalt. And then you had inside, we had the yellow marigolds, and the yellow and blue were really good color combinations. It plays really well with the color wheel. And then here we have some more containers with the bright blues, and we use a lot of like bright yellows, reds, and oranges in these containers. And sometimes, when you're planting a container, you can just keep it simple. Like really small containers, I have a tendency just to plant one variety of plant in there. And some of the larger ones, I'll plant a few more varieties, but usually simple is always a good way to go. And of course, bright colors will provide a high impact. And for people that have not a lot of space, maybe some people live in an apartment or they don't have a large yard, getting plants off the ground is a good idea, going vertical. So in areas with limited spaces, you can have, we have these pyramids here. And one thing that I like to plant in the pyramids is like herbs is a good idea. Or you can just have some annuals for a nice color. And then also we have our flower towers, which are throughout the park. And then you can also use like window boxes, like if you have stairway that you want to have like some nice color added to there, you can do window boxes or have hanging baskets hanging off of them. And then in this display here, we kind of using Mother Nature as the backdrop. So in the surrounding landscaping, this is actually at the Mexico Pavilion at Epcot. There's a lot of tropical plants in the environment. So with these containers, we brought some of the tropicals that are in the landscaping and we featured some of them in the containers. So it all kind of like blends together. And then one good thing about growing tropicals in containers is if the temperatures start to drop, if it's going to be too cold, you can always move those indoors to protect them from a freeze. Then here we have some containers and like some, you can use cooler colors. So cooler colors, you know, they go well like whites and silvers with a lot of other colors. But then again, you know, they can, they're very effective alone. And then I like to use containers that have a really wide mouth, especially the barrels. That way I can feature more plants and I can get like really creative in my designs. And then the pot is very impactful. So if you have a container where you have cascading plants, we always like to keep them trimmed so you can still see majority of the pot. It's okay to have them cascading a little, but you want to make sure they're not touching the ground. Now, one thing I am kind of guilty of is not really following that rule, because if you notice the slide back at the Four Seasons with the Vista Indigo super petunias, those were doing so great that I just kind of let those cascade all the way down to the ground. But these containers are very fun to make, the fairy gardens, these hypertufa pots. So when you're designing those containers, it's very important to pay close attention to detail. So some of the containers I've designed over the years, I've designed some like rock gardens, and I actually was able to find rocks that had like fossils in them. So that was like some little tiny detail. Also, when you're planting the plants, it's good to choose plants that are going to stay relatively small. Now, sometimes we'll use like cypress trees that will normally get to close to 100 feet tall, but we bring them in as small liner plants and we make sure we're pruning them. So these type of containers, it's a good idea to keep everything like trimmed and well maintained. And it's also fun to put like, you can build your own fairy house, or you can purchase one, and you can build like little water scenes, and there's all kinds of accessories you can put inside these containers to make them really fun. And this is a good project for like kids and the entire family. And then also we have seasonal displays here, and especially during around Christmas time, we'll use a lot of poinsettias. Here in this slide to the left, this picture, we have some ice crystal poinsettias that are featured in the flower tower. And then we also combine poinsettias with various like evergreen shrubs, like holly will include sometimes in the containers, or we'll use Dianella, which is featured in the barrels here. But not only at like Christmas time, we also have like Easter displays. So we'll have like special character meet and greets, and we'll use like Easter lilies, and sometimes we'll bring in some flowering bulbs. They won't last quite as long, but we'll just use them short term for like different seasons. And then in the fall, we'll bring in like chrysanthemums and have displays with mums. And then soil. So the soil, it's always good to make sure you're not buying like cheaper soil, like topsoil. It's good to have soil that's amended with like perlite, vermiculite. You want stuff that's like light and airy. And then sometimes like peat moss is good to have added into the soil. And we use this a lot, especially for like hanging basket production, all the container basket production. It's very good to have that soil. And then fertilizing. So when we first create the containers, we'll actually add like some mulch, or sometimes you can use like plastic bottles to make them a little lighter weight. But we always mix in a slow release granular fertilizer into the soil. And once the plants become more established and they're becoming more mature, we'll follow up with a liquid fertilizer, and that helps promote blooms. And then I just want to, Debbie and I just want to thank everyone for joining us today for today's presentation. If we have any questions, we'll be glad to answer them.
Thank you so much, guys, for that amazing presentation. I know that, whenever we think about color, and using color in a landscape, most people compare themselves to Disney. I mean, they want to do it the Disney way. And so we all aspire to do it as well as you guys do. And you showed some amazing images. So thank you so much for that expertise. We do have some questions that have come, so I'll field these to you guys. What kind of paint do you use for your different types of containers?
Paint?
So the containers, we usually, when we buy them in from the vendor, they're already painted. But if they need touch-ups, then we can just contact the vendor and we can purchase like a little sample of the paint they have. But we don't, like the drip containers, those already come in pre-painted.
Yes, but the silver containers, it was automotive paint that was used on those to make them really bright and shiny on the plastic.
So those containers were plastic.
Yeah, they were plastic. The round ones that were really bright yellow and blue, yeah, they're plastic. And then we sent them to a person that does automotive painting, and then they prepped them and painted them.
Very cool. How are your flower towers built?
The flower towers are built by a company named, we can tell you because they're out there, Garci. And we've had them for many, many years. So we saw them at a landscape show probably 25 years ago and bought them in. So they're different pieces of metal that are different sizes, bowls within each other. And then they hook together with a secured hook that you hook together each bowl. And then there's drainage that goes through the bottom. We originally used to do irrigation in them, but we found that it's easier just to hand water them. So we start with the bottom bowl and then start adding the soil going up per level of the flower tower. And one thing we didn't talk about is soil. When we use soil in containers, or it could be the flower towers, one of the things we don't do, and this is probably against a lot of people, but we don't necessarily always change the soil, because if you're going to have a container, say, for a year of 4 to 6 change outs, what we do is we take the flowers out. As long as there's not a lot of disease, then we take a trowel and we rough up the soil. We amend the soil with some fresh soil if we need a little bit more, but we keep the original soil in there because we feel like we're adding the nutrients through the granular fertilizer and the liquid fertilizer in the short period of time that they're there. It saves a lot of money. And then also using the plastic bottles. And then another thing I wanted to mention about the soils was, a lot of you have probably seen the hydrofiber out there in the industry. And the success, like we still use only pure sphagnum with perlite and vermiculite in our mostly in all of our containers, in our baskets, because it really has a consistency drying out. But where it really worked well is the flower towers. And then it also really worked well in our floating gardens, which stay in the water all the time. So just a bit of information. When you look at a bag of soil, you'll see a lot of soils now have that hydrofiber in it.
Very good. Do you ever have any issues with your towers blowing over?
No, the towers weigh a lot, and they are on pallets. So we have customized pallets put on the bottom of the tower, and that allows us to move them with those electric pallet jacks. And if we're going to have a hurricane or a storm, they would always come in.
Do you often use shrubs in the center of a pot to kind of add some extra height that you may keep that plant there from season to season?
Yeah, so some containers we use are mostly shrubs, and then we'll maybe mix in some ornamental grasses, or we'll just add like a few little annuals like violas, for example. I know over at Epcot during the Flower and Garden Festival in the Norway Pavilion, we use a lot of shrubs in those containers for like the Anna and Elsa set and the troll. And then we'll just add like little accents of annuals, and those shrubs will last for years. So we can just swap out like 2 or 3 annuals in the containers.
Yeah, one of our staple plants is iris. It's a really great plant to add to containers. It gives a lot of height.
Yeah, and some color too.
Yeah, Laura petalum too.
Mhm.
Okay, very nice. A little bit of interest in the chat box about how long it takes to change out some of your large displays.
Hmm.
There's always interest in that Disney magic that you guys perform. So, just share with folks, what does it take to change out a large display like at the entrance of Epcot, for instance?
Overnight. It's always, if we're gonna do something, it's always on an overnight. So we would come in, we usually come in at midnight or between 11 and midnight. And then all of the flowers, say if it's a flower bed, all those flowers are they put them on racks. So they're pre-staged, what we call pre-staged backstage. And then the racks are brought in with off-road vehicles. And that bed is stripped and turned over by the time you come in as a guest.
That really is magic. That's very cool. And it's all ready for the first guests to enter the gates the next morning.
Yeah, so you always have to make sure that you're pre-booking. So we have what's called a bedding plant. We have our own bedding plant program, and our bedding plants, all our beds are mapped out on a landscape plan. Beds are numbered and measured. So you know how many square foot you have to the bed and how many annuals you're going to need, or bedding, whatever you want to put in there, and how many you would have to order per size of plant. Then you're going to decide on the seasonality, what varieties of plants you're going to use. You put it into the computer, and then it almost generates it'll generate a work order. And then we send that off to our vendors, and we pre-book those plants through them to grow.
Very cool. Talk a little bit more about your watering. I know you mentioned that with the flower towers, you used to build in irrigation, but you found out hand watering is better. Are most of your containers hand watered?
Yes, all of our containers are hand watered, and the best thing you need is a good wand. And if you're going to water the flower towers, you have to have a really long wand to reach up to the top. And then you want to have a good nozzle on the end, something like a shower head. You don't want to blast the containers because it's going to take the flowers off. And we generally don't water the flowers. We're only watering the container itself. So there's crews of people that go around Epcot. That's all they do from March 3rd till July. When the festival ends, there's a crew that just goes around and just does the watering of the containers. So you really have to get to know the container, and then selecting the right plant material. If you're going to do succulents, a lot of times you want to just do succulents alone because you're not going to water those as much.
And we try to avoid overhead watering as much as possible.
Yes.
Okay, and that becomes a little more difficult when you've got a full container. Obviously, a
Oh,
container
yeah,
that's
yeah.
full of plants.
Right, yes. Sometimes it can be a little challenging, trying to maneuver the wand in between the plants. But with the flower towers, it's inevitable that we're going to have to get the foliage wet.
Mhm.
What are some of your favorite vines to use?
Mhm.
So vines, we use the passion flower is a good one to use. We have a Patria vine that we grow over at Epcot. You'll see it in the UK pavilion on the arbor that has some beautiful purple
Mandevilla.
flowers.
Mandevilla.
Oh yeah, Mandevilla is another
There's
good
a lot
one.
of good varieties of Mandevilla that even at the local garden centers that you can pick up. They really have done well with that plant, breeding that plant to just amazing color and easy care.
And then we'll use like a Mexican flame vine and the butterfly house because that's good to attract pollinators like butterflies.
Very cool. A lot of neat plant choices, and I know they change with the years as new plant material comes into vogue. What do you do with your leftover plants?
Well,
So those actually get composted,
yeah,
and they will get reused at some form or another.
yeah.
Okay.
we try to hold on to things that we can, but for the most part, the plants are the longevity of the plant because of the seasonality. So if it's a viola, it's only lasting until April at the latest anyway, because that's its season. So we take them to the compost.
But some containers that have like the succulents and the cacti and like shrubs, we'll use those for like multiple years. So we'll just leave those and just kind of do a little bit of maintenance here and there, make sure they're being watered throughout the year. But those you'll see being reused for the following year.
Do you sometimes choose plant material in containers to draw a guest's eye away from certain areas, almost like camouflage? Just to, like keeping people from looking at, employee areas, for instance?
Our trade secrets now. Yes. Yes, we do that. Even, especially like with construction walls, we might do a grouping of containers. So it kind of draws your eye away from the construction wall, or if there's an area that's down that may not have a construction wall, we'll put plants up. So yes.
Yeah, so we have one style of container that's actually on wheels, and it's like rectangular shaped, and we'll plant like podocarpus in there, and the podocarpus will get like nice and tall, and we'll make sure we're keeping it, manicured, and we'll use those as a screen to hide like construction areas.
Very cool. The plantings at the land, the vertical hydroponic towers, they said are lovely. Do you have any plant suggestions for those type containers?
We don't really deal too much with the hydroponic systems.
Yeah, that's actually the
Yeah.
Epcot Science Department
Yeah.
that grows all the hydroponics, but I know they use a wide variety of vegetables.
Yeah,
I've seen-
Nicotiana, right?
Yeah, Nicotiana, I think some squash growing over there, some coconuts.
Okay. Do you have any favorite native plants that you might use?
Hmm. Okay.
I use sometimes frog fruit. It's kind of an unusual plant. That's a good native one to use.
Yeah, very cool.
And then
Yeah.
coreopsis is the state flower, so we got to use
Yeah.
coreopsis in our containers.
Exactly. Well, fantastic. This was so good, so inspirational. You've got me all excited about redoing my container gardens at the house, and hopefully, you've given, our audience some really nice tips on, what they can do for some of their clients, and how they can improve some of their container gardens at some of their clients' homes and businesses. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule, and I know it's the flower and garden season, so thank you so much for being part of this. And I want to remind our audience that our next professional webinar is going to be coming up on June 13th at 10 a.m. Eastern time, and we'll have Dr. Phil Harmon talking about mosaic disease of St. Augustine. Susan, Debbie, thank you so much
thank
you.
again
Thank you
for
all
being
so
part of
much.
this.
Yeah, I
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed the time with you.
Yeah.
Everybody, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next month. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.